I want to thank everybody for being here this morning. I want to thank you for attending this important hearing on human rights in Honduras. I want to thank J.P. Schuster and the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this hearing today. I also want to thank our witnesses, some of whom have traveled from Honduras to be here with us this morning. I appreciate it. I want to thank you for being here to testify and for everything that you do to promote and protect human rights in Honduras. As a longtime follower of events in Latin America, I'm especially honored to engage our distinguished witnesses on the current human rights situation in Honduras. The past few years have been difficult and turbulent ones for the people of Honduras. As many of you know, in June 2009, a coup ousted then-President Manuel Zelaya from office, and Roberto Micheletti was appointed interim president. During the period of the Micheletti administration, the human rights situations deteriorated considerably. Public demonstrations were often met with a disproportionate use of force, and many people were arbitrarily detained and held in cruel, inhuman, and degrading conditions. Honduras became increasingly militarized, and there was a surge in racial and gender discrimination across the country, among other grave violations of civil and political rights. Regrettably, security and human rights in Honduras have not improved since President Lobo was elected in November of 2009, and if anything, they've deteriorated. As widely publicized, last year, Honduras gained the unwanted title of being the homicide capital of the world, with 86 murders per 100,000 people, and is viewed as one of the most dangerous places in the world right now. Remember, this is not a country fighting a civil war. It is not somewhere on the other side of the world. Honduras is a neighbor, an ally, and a friend. Among the most worrying aspects of this violence, and one I am particularly interested in examining today, is the severe threat to press freedom and the protection of journalists in Honduras. According to Honduras's own National Commission for Human Rights, at least 36 journalists and social commentators have been killed since 2003, with 29 of the murders occurring during the current Lobo administration. In the most recent case, the charred and mutilated body of radio journalist Annabelle Barrow was discovered just 2 weeks ago on a riverbank near the city of San Pedro Sula. Exactly 1 year ago today, during a commission hearing on global press freedom, we heard testimony from Jesuit priest Ismael Moreno Cotto, also known as Father Melo, who works for the Catholic community radio station Radio Progreso. Less than 2 weeks after he returned to Honduras, Radio Progreso was raided by Honduran police and reporters, and local campesinos who were there being interviewed were threatened. This was not an extreme or unusual case, but rather the norm faced by many journalists in Honduras. So I'm deeply concerned about the role that the police and military units have played in Honduras's ongoing human rights crisis. Elements of the Honduran police are alleged to be carrying out extrajudicial killings of suspected gang members and other perceived criminals as part of the so-called social cleansing operations. Honduran Police Chief Juan Carlos Bonilla has been linked to 3 homicides and 11 other deaths or disappearances, while many of the country's police are suspected to be involved in organized crime. Most troubling for me is the fact that the United States may be bolstering these very same offenders through our foreign assistance, which includes $16 million to fund Honduras police units so far this year. This is not a new problem. In May of 2011, I felt obligated to lead a letter with 87 members of Congress asking the State Department to suspend U.S. assistance to the military and police in Honduras due to the lack of any mechanism to ensure security forces are held accountable for abuses. Last month, my colleagues in the Senate called into serious question the State Department's certification of fiscal year 2012 funds designated for Honduran military and police. That certification effectively told the Honduran government that U.S. human rights conditions in the FY 2012 appropriations bills were sufficiently met. I think this appears far from the case. I am also concerned about the rule of law in Honduras, and especially the justice sector's inability to investigate crimes and capture, try, and convict those responsible. These are all important issues to discuss in light of critical U.S.-Honduras strategic dialogue, which I understand is scheduled for next week. In a national public radio story broadcast earlier this month about soaring corruption among Honduras police ranks, the interviewer spoke with the mother of a young man who had gone out to a store one night and was found at 4 o'clock in the morning with 2 bullets in the back of his head. She told the reporter, "We are plagued with questions. We want to know what happened, why it happened." Her enormous suffering is made more severe with the knowledge that only 2% of crimes are solved in Honduras. So we are here today because we owe it to that mother to ask those same questions. What is happening and why is it happening? As a government that provides assistance to the Honduran government, we are also obligated to ask what the U.S. can do to improve human rights protections for the people of Honduras. Finally, on a sadder note, I wanted to take a moment to recognize that just yesterday, Honduran Judge Mireya Mendoza Peña, a member of the Executive Committee of the Honduran Association of Judges for Democracy, was assassinated in Honduras in broad daylight. She was murdered while driving her car by two men on a motorcycle who sprayed her vehicle with 20 bullets, according to the initial media reports. I wish to express my deepest sympathies to her family, friends, colleagues, and loved ones, some of whom are here today. Our thoughts and prayers are with all of you. And I call on the Honduran authorities to investigate and bring to justice the perpetrators of this heinous crime. With that, I want to acknowledge my colleague, Congressman Frank Wolf, the co-chair of this commission from Virginia, and if he has any opening comments.
Well, just briefly, I want to thank the chairman and identify with your comments, and I want to welcome Senator Kane. You know, I know he has a lot of experience. Also, I'm interested, I had a daughter who did the same thing. She worked down in Honduras for 2 years, taught, and I went down there to visit her a number of times, and I think the very fact what you're trying to do, we should send a very, very, very strong message, and so I appreciate Tim coming over and testifying to your leadership.
Well, it's now my pleasure to welcome our first witness, Senator Tim Kaine, who represents the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Senator Kaine is a longtime advocate for justice and peace in Honduras. We are especially grateful that you are here to share your perspective on these critical issues, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Co-Chairman McGovern and Co-Chairman Wolf, and members of the Commission, and especially to the witnesses who will testify to follow me. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify in front of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission on this very important issue. It's important to the people of Honduras. It's important to the thousands and thousands of Honduran Americans who live in Virginia and in the United States. It's important to our U.S. foreign policy, but it is also personally important to me. I especially want to thank you both for your invitation to be here today. Congressman Wolf is the senior member of the Virginia delegation, and I'm the junior member, but I much admire his focus on these issues and love working together with him on them. Over 30 years, I took a year off from law school to live in El Progreso, Honduras, and work with Jesuit missionaries there, the same Jesuit missionaries who courageously operated Radio Progreso now for about 4 decades. It was 1980, and all of Central America was very, very dangerous in 1980. There was a military dictatorship in power in Honduras. It was the tail end of the Cold War. Civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala were pouring refugees across the border into the part of Honduras where I lived. The United States was using the southern part of the country as a staging ground for the conflict in Nicaragua. My Jesuit colleagues lived under tremendous threat. Many were threatened, some were imprisoned, and a few even lost their lives during those years. Once I left Honduras, I stayed in touch and engaged with the Jesuit community in Honduras and was able to visit again in 2004 to introduce my friends in Honduras to my wife, Ann. The experience in Honduras really shaped my worldview and the person I am today. It taught me a lot about faith. It taught me a lot about faith's capacity to overcome adversity. It taught me a lot about the way many people in the world live, very different than how I had grown up in terms of levels of material comfort. But it also taught me a lot about this country. As a young man there, I was able to more appreciate the safety and freedoms of the United States, particularly in the early 1980s with the military dictatorship. Honduran citizens didn't have the opportunity to vote. That has made me take voting and our democratic institutions more seriously as an adult. And that's why what's happened in Honduras over the subsequent decades is so troubling. In the early 1980s, it was a military dictatorship. The country has transitioned to democracy, but it's less safe today, sadly. We would hope that the transition to democracy would improve safety and liberty, and in some ways it seems that it's gone significantly backward. Honduras faces huge human rights challenges. Witnesses to follow will give probably more up-to-date and focused testimony than I will, but you know the general security situation in the country has so deteriorated. Human rights abuses, including attacks on the press, extrajudicial killings by security forces have dramatically increased. Over the last decade, homicide rates have skyrocketed as Co-Chair McGovern indicated, in 2012, Honduras had the highest homicide rate in the world. This friend, this ally, this country that's been such a reliable partner with the United States, the highest homicide rate in the world with 86 murders per 100,000 residents. Here's something that I find particularly compelling. It's hard to find another relationship in the 50-year history of the Peace Corps that has been as strong as the relationship between the United States and Honduras, but due to violence, the United States has suspended Peace Corps operations after 50 years of strong partnership. Some of this has to do with lack of capacity and lack of resources. Obviously, it has to do with the drug trade and demand for drugs, which we continue to have to try to reduce in this country. But the troubling part is corruption in Honduran institutions and a lack of accountability for those responsible. The current administration, the Lobo administration, has taken a number of steps, often under U.S. or international pressure, to improve human rights in Honduras. That's why hearings like these are so important. Continued attention on these issues is absolutely critical. For example, in January 2013, the Lobo administration adopted a new human rights policy and plan of action that has been drafted by the Secretariat for Justice and Human Rights after extensive consultations with civil society. Hearings like this and other hearings have the way, I think, can have the effect of encouraging more efforts. But many of the reform efforts today have stalled. And many have questioned whether the Lobo administration has the political will to carry out reforms necessary to clean up and strengthen the country's security forces and justice sector institutions. Human rights organizations maintain that the President's efforts have been insufficient. The administration has failed to hold sufficiently accountable those responsible for attacks on victims based solely on their profession or activism. The United States administration and Congress have pursued a number of policies to address this situation. The backbone of the administration's approach is the Central American Regional Security Initiative, CARSI, which has allocated approximately $60 million to Honduras. Some of this funding has been used to set up a special victims task force to investigate attacks against journalists and other high-profile violent crime cases. There's also been support in the past for police reform, although progress on that reform has stalled. Just last Tuesday, I heard from the Jesuit community in Honduras with whom I maintain a very good communicative relationship. They recently translated an audit done of the Special Prosecutor for Human Rights in Honduras with the hopes of pinpointing places where the Honduran government could invest to combat impunity and human rights abuses by state authorities. The audit revealed that already this year, the Human Rights Special Prosecutor has received nearly 500 complaints of human rights abuses by state officials. There are other human rights abuses, but more than 500 complaints of human rights abuses by state officials, the overwhelming majority inflicted by police. Yet there's only one investigator who is working full-time, and that investigator is detailed from the very police that he is tasked with investigating. I would encourage this commission, and I would love to work on this as well, to press the administration to engage with the Honduran government as early as next week as a new public prosecutor is chosen. This will be critical to ensuring accountability for state-sponsored human rights infractions and creating some level of lifting confidence among the public that human rights issues will be taken seriously. Some of the most disturbing individual cases that the Jesuit community in Honduras continues to follow involve the co-opting of state officials and entities to carry out the will of powerful private individuals. Specifically, mining company coercion and intimidation of campesino communities in the Tela municipality of Atlántida are disturbing. I do commend the State Department and the Embassy in Tegucigalpa for responding to some of my concerns and those of my friends in the Jesuit community in Honduras, but more needs to be done. When I heard that I would have the opportunity to serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, I saw it as an opportunity to work on foreign policy issues in the Western Hemisphere. For too long, this is my own personal opinion, the U.S. has focused its foreign policy on an east-west axis rather than a north-south axis. And more needs to be done to respect the fact that we have so many partnerships and so much good work to be done on a north-south axis. As a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and member of the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, I'm proud to work on and hopefully raise the profile of these issues. Finally, let me just say this. I thank the Commission for your dedication. The very origins of this Commission are an expression of some powerful American values and the belief that if we shine a spotlight on abuses, that's one of the most powerful things we can do. So many victims suffer because they're forgotten, they're not paid attention to, and if we can shine a spotlight, we can help them. Your dedication to educating members of Congress on the most pressing human rights issues of the day, is important. And I'm honored to participate and have my testimony be submitted for the record on the human rights situation in Honduras. So to my co-chairs, I thank you. I appreciate the invitation to come be with you today, and I look forward to doing any work together with you to address this serious concern.
Well, I thank you very much for coming here. I think your mere presence here, I think, is a signal to the Honduran government that we're very concerned about the human rights situation in Honduras. And there must be something in the water in Virginia between you and Frank Wolf, where there's a real passion for human rights, which is really welcome here in the Congress. And while you were here, just wanted to acknowledge that Congresswoman Bonamici from Oregon and Congressman Farr from California came in while you were speaking. And I know you have a busy schedule, but we want, on behalf of the entire commission, I want to thank you for being here, and it's important testimony. Thank you. What do we got? So what do you think we should do? Yeah, what do you think we should do? We got 10 minutes left to vote. How many votes? All right, so just to kind of let you know what's going on, they called a series of votes just now, and we're here to hear from Lisa Hogard, the Executive Director of the Latin America Working Group, Dr. Dana Frank, Professor of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Ms. Teresa Flores Lanza, a lawyer, former magistrate of the Court of Appeals for San Pedro Sula, and Ms. Vivian Jacamen, the Director for Latin America Programs for Freedom House. And what do you think? So what I'm going to suggest we do, because I mean, the panel can make yourself comfortable up here, but we're going to have to go for votes. So we will come back as soon as the votes are over. Does that, I know I will. I know some people got to catch planes, but does that make we don't think we should begin, right? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to go on hold. I'm sorry, but we don't control these votes. Thank you. We'll be back. Okay, we're back. Sorry, everybody, but I also want to acknowledge in the audience former Ambassador Bill Walker of El Salvador, who's here as a longtime friend. Thank you. So I've introduced everybody, and why don't we begin with Lisa Hogard, the Executive Director of the Latin America Working Group, and appreciate your patience. Thank you.
Thanks to the honorable co-chairs of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for hosting this important hearing and for the opportunity to testify today. The situation of human rights in Honduras is critical. The 2009 coup undermined already weak institutions intended to protect the citizenry. The Honduran state is failing to protect its citizens in fundamental ways. The government fails to provide effective protection measures for those at risk. The police not only fail to investigate crimes, some members are implicated in corruption and murder, and the judicial system is failing to achieve justice. The international community can only help Honduras by fully recognizing the extent of the challenges, working with civil society for change, and adhering to a strong and principled human rights policy. Senator Kane and Mr. McGovern mentioned the problems of violence in Honduras. Indeed, street crime and organized crime are responsible each for a significant share of violence. As drug interdiction in the Caribbean and Mexico disrupted drug routes, trafficking through Honduras increased, bringing with it higher levels of violent crime. And that needs effective crime prevention strategies, including education and job programs that help young people stay out of gangs, and programs to reduce the high rate of domestic violence, among other kinds of programs. But it would be a real mistake to look at the surge of violence and describe it as just ordinary crime or drug violence. Journalists, members of the LGBT community, small farmer activists, lawyers, human rights defenders, and opposition activists are among the victims of targeted crime. This targeted violence is a legacy of the coup. During the coup and in the months the de facto government ruled, civil liberties were suspended. Police and soldiers violently repressed protests. The army occupied radio stations. Arbitrary detentions were carried out on a sweeping scale, and people were brutally beaten in detention. A human rights defender told me, after the coup, people had the idea they could do whatever they wanted, no holds barred. The coup unleashed violence and a sense that any authority or anyone who felt entitled in any way could do whatever they wished without consequences. The elections that brought Porfirio Lobo to office were seen as illegitimate by some sectors of the Honduran public and many governments, although they were recognized by the United States. After taking office in January 2010, as Senator Kane mentioned, the Lobo administration has taken some steps intended to strengthen human rights. For example, it established a Ministry of Justice and Human Rights, which developed a national action plan for human rights. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission was launched to investigate the 2009 ouster of President Zelaya. That commission concluded that a coup had taken place and that human rights violations by police and military were widespread following the coup. However, almost no one has been held accountable for these abuses, and moreover, serious human rights abuses continue. And now I'm going to talk about the abuses under the current government. First, violent repression of protests continues. For example, in San Pedro Sula in September 2010, police used tear gas in clubs and brutally beat demonstrators. In March 2011, a teacher at a protest was hit by a tear gas canister, fell, and was run over by a truck. She died later that night. These and many other repressive actions are vividly described in the Civil Society True Commission report, which covers the period of the coup through August 2011 and shows a continuation of such abuses well into the Lobo administration. Although the scale of repression of protests seems to have subsided at the moment, it has not ended. Just 2 days ago, protesting students were hit with tear gas canisters in front of the National University. Almost no security forces involved in brutality have been dismissed or prosecuted. Second, from the coup to the present, certain groups have been targeted with violence. The state's responsibility is threefold. It is failing to protect vulnerable individuals, it is failing to investigate and prosecute these cases, and in some cases, too many, state agents appear to be involved. 36 journalists were killed between 2003 and today, as you mentioned, with 29 killed since the start of 2010. 97% of these cases remain in impunity. At least 57 people, and maybe more, associated with small farmer associations in Bajo Aguan have been killed in the context of the land conflict in the last 3 years. Security guards on plantations and others have also been killed. Most of these murders remain in impunity, and the violence continues. From 2008 through February 2013, more than 90 LGBTI persons were murdered in Honduras, 24 in 2012 alone. Human Rights Watch notes with concern the alleged involvement of members of the Honduran police in some of these violent abuses. With U.S. support, a special victims unit is investigating some of these murders. 64 lawyers have been killed since January 2010. When I submitted my written testimony last night, it was 63. 97% of these cases remain in impunity. Human rights defenders have been threatened, beaten, had their office broken into, and many have been killed. 16 candidates for Libre, the opposition party established after the coup, have been murdered since June 2012. Violence is not only directed against opposition candidates, but that is a very striking number. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called on Honduras to provide protection measures to hundreds of people at risk because of these situations. But protection is grossly inadequate. An effective protection program should be established in consultation with vulnerable groups. The most effective protection, as we all know, is in actually investigating and prosecuting threats and attacks. Yet of 426 cases of people for whom the Commission issued precautionary measures, a recent study shows that only 15 cases have been concluded. A third problem is that the justice system more broadly is failing to investigate state agents. The special prosecutor for human rights charged with investigating such abuses, as the senator noted, lacks adequate prosecutors, analysts, and investigators. Investigators are provided by the police and accountable to the police, making it difficult to investigate crimes committed by the police themselves. A fourth and central problem is that corruption and abuse within the police is rampant. In October 2011, 2 young men, the son of the rector of the National University and his friend, were killed by members of the police. These tragic murders, which brought to the fore claims of numerous extrajudicial executions attributed to police, appeared at first to catalyze police reform efforts. The government created a new agency to evaluate and dismiss officers implicated in crime and corruption, and a national commission to propose police reforms. However, that reform effort appears stalled. While the Honduran government says that hundreds of police have been dismissed, the evaluation agency itself reported that of 230 police who failed vetting tests, polygraphs, only 7 were removed, and some of those have been reinstated. Yet the answer to the problem of the police is not to send the army into the streets. Unfortunately, that is taking place. The Congress passed a decree in 2011 granting the military power to police for a 90-day period, and that has been renewed ever since. Military troops patrol Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula and other areas. The Honduran Congress just added 1,000 more military troops to crime-fighting efforts and is considering creating a special military trained police unit. The ministry that oversaw the police was recently merged with defense. These measures are all the more tragic because Honduras in the last 2 decades took some steps to reduce the role of the military in policing and place the police under civilian control. My testimony has not reviewed U.S. policy during this period. As another colleague, Dr. Frank, is covering this subject. But I would like to conclude with some recommendations for U.S. policy going forward. They start from the premise that the United States must thoroughly remake its Honduras policy to achieve a principled, effective human rights policy. The upcoming bilateral human rights dialogue between the 2 countries offers an opportunity to reset policy. The United States should encourage and support strengthening of the justice system, including reforms that would, such as ensuring the justice system has independent investigators, which would permit it to effectively investigate state actors committing abuses. It should press for progress on key cases. The United States should not supply military and training. There's no justification for this. It should urge the Honduran government to remove the armed forces from policing and ensure that the police is subordinate to a civilian agency. Given the extent of abuse right now, of police abuse right now, the United States should not supply police aid, but should focus on encouraging real progress on measures to purge, reform, and establish functional oversight and controls over the police. If, however, security assistance is provided, at a bare minimum, it must be attached to human rights conditions, and those conditions must be strictly enforced, both the specific country conditions and the Leahy Law. In addition, the United States should not contribute to Honduras's human rights problems by promoting counter-narcotics operations of a sort that puts civilians at risk, as happened in a joint operation in Nahuas in May 2012, in which 4 civilians were killed, including a 14-year-old boy. Any counter-narcotics operation should obviously adhere to international human rights standards. The State Department and the Embassy should speak out in support of human rights in Honduras. That means denouncing threats and attacks against all kinds of human rights defenders, journalists, the LGBT community, and others at risk. I don't know, this one seems so easy, and I don't know why our Embassy and the State Department is not doing a better job at simply speaking out. The United States should, of course, maintain a neutral...
I don't either, and I was going to ask, that was going to be one of my questions, but I'll save that until everybody's testified. Okay.
That is I don't have the answer to that. The United States should obviously maintain a neutral stance in the upcoming elections, encourage fair and transparent elections, and monitor and speak out against any violence in the electoral period. And finally, and I think this is also an important point, the United States should diplomatically and financially support the establishment of a stronger UN presence in Honduras. This could mean a CICIG-like mechanism, as in Guatemala, or an Office of the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights in Honduras with a very strong mandate. The Honduran government, is my understanding, has welcomed a UN presence, as have some key civil society actors. Honduras, the United Nations, the United States, and the international community should act promptly to make this a reality, and I don't think that, that the finances should be a bar to making this happen. The international community is investing in Honduras. Why not make it go towards a UN presence that might help? Thank you very much for the opportunity to address the Commission.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Now we'll turn to Dr. Dana Frank, Professor of History at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you. I'd like to thank the committee for the honor of this invitation, and in particular thank both chairs for their support for human rights issues in Honduras and for holding this hearing. Although I'm going to address U.S. policy in Honduras, I want to say very clearly that I support Ms. Haugard's testimony in every word. Sadly, the United States is continuing to support the current Honduran government, or Porfirio Lobo, that is in many ways responsible for the country's dire human rights situation. While the Obama administration has begun to express concern about issues regarding impunity and police corruption, it remains in close partnership with the Lobo administration. Although exact figures are difficult to obtain, the Obama administration has evidently increased its military and police funding for Honduras every year since 2009, the year of the coup, when it partially and temporarily suspended some funds. Since the coup, the United States' own military presence has also continued to expand, including the expenditure of $24 million to construct permanent U.S. barracks at Soto Cano Air Force Base for the first time, and the construction of at least 3 new U.S. military bases. U.S. funding for Honduran state security forces continues despite the fact that President Lobo is increasing the military's role in domestic policing. Neither the U.S. Department of State nor the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa has spoken publicly criticizing the militarization of the Honduran police. I'm very sorry to report that the State Department continues to countenance human rights abuses in Honduras. In response to the human rights conditions placed by the U.S. Congress on 20% of police and military aid for Honduras in the 2012 State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Act, the Department of State in August 2012 reported that it was releasing the funds because the Honduran government, it said, had made adequate progress in addressing freedom of association, freedom of media freedom, due process of law, and prosecution of state security forces allegedly involved in human rights violations. The State Department did report that it had withheld funds for the Honduran National Chief of Police, Juan Carlos Bonilla, and anyone under his direct supervision until allegations of his death squad activity are investigated in accordance with the Leahy Act. As of this writing, almost a year later, the Department of State still has not publicly reported as to its conclusions regarding Bonilla. Disturbingly, on May 13th, Assistant Secretary of State Brownfield told the Spanish news service EFE, quote, "I respect the work that Bonilla is doing. I admire him," thus sending a chilling message to the Honduran people. Other prominent cases also suggest the need for widespread application of the Leahy Act in Honduras. Hector Ivan Mejia, the current director of the Preventive Police, the largest body of the Honduran police, for example, is being prosecuted for repressing a peaceful demonstration of the opposition when he was chief of police in San Pedro Sula in 2010. Mejia remains free on his own reconnaissance, has never been suspended from his duties, and has been promoted twice since his prosecution began, and he's been promoted by Juan Carlos Bonilla. In another prominent example, the U.S.-funded 15th Battalion of the Honduran Armed Forces has allegedly committed a wide range of documented human rights abuses in the Owan Valley. Unfortunately, the Department of State has been tepid at best in responding to the larger climate of terror and repression of civil liberties in Honduras. In the past year, in large part because of congressional pressure, the State Department has begun to speak publicly about human rights issues, including threats to LGBT people, journalists, and lawyers, and to call for a cleanup of the police judiciary and the prosecutor's office. However, after 4 years now of brutal repression and threats, the State Department has yet to mention publicly or roundly denounce the pattern of concerted repression of the opposition, including the electoral opposition. It has not, for example, spoken forcefully of the pattern of concerted assassinations of campesino or small farmer activists in the Awan Valley, or spoken publicly about the recent death threats to Jose Maria Martinez, a prominent radio journalist and trade unionist. The present situation is especially alarming as the November 18th elections approach, because at least 16 activists in Libre, the leading opposition party, have been killed since June 2012. While the State Department does report that it supports a new major crimes task force, a special victims unit, and other units within the Honduran police, such support remains of questionable value given the lack of political will on the part of top levels of the Honduran government and the charges against its highest police authorities. In sum, the United States continues, unfortunately, to legitimate and pour military and police funding into a deeply corrupt government that is allegedly committing widespread human rights abuses with near complete impunity and is countenancing a largely non-functional judicial system. While in the past year the State Department has finally begun to take some of the human rights issues somewhat seriously, its initiatives remain token and by far overshadowed by the larger message it is sending through its military and police funding, its praise for Bonilla, its failure to fully apply the Leahy Act, and its greater silence regarding repression of the opposition. I'm sorry to report that in Honduras, the United States is widely perceived as the power behind both the 2009 coup and its continuance and its terrible aftermath, and the U.S. Embassy is popularly understood by many as a force continuing to undermine human rights and democracy rather than vigorously promoting both. Here I would like to propose a more constructive approach that would restore U.S. credibility and send a message throughout Latin America that the United States is serious about human rights. In my opinion, the United States should immediately cut all police and military funding to Honduras until benchmarks demonstrating serious progress in human rights have been met. The conditions placed by Congress on current aid in the Appropriations Act should be thoroughly respected, and the Leahy Act immediately observed in full. More broadly, the United States needs to clearly and publicly distance itself from the Lobo administration and publicly criticize the corruption at the top of the Honduran government in all its branches. As the November 18th presidential election approaches, it is imperative that the State Department announce publicly and unequivocally that it does not support any specific candidate, publicly or privately, and that it will do everything in its power to ensure not only a free and fair election in November, but also guarantee that in the next 4 months leading up to the elections, Hondurans can campaign and debate freely in a climate free of repression. The State Department should also publicly and roundly condemn the concerted pattern of the repression, including Libre, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and indigenous campesino activists, LGBT people, and trade unionists. The State Department should also speak out immediately against the participation of the Honduran military in policing activities and call attention to the alarming increase of such practices and their dangerous outcomes. It should help restore the integrity of the judiciary and prosecutors and an end to impunity by first demanding that the 4 judges and magistrates who were deposed for opposing the coup be immediately restored to their positions, and that includes Judge Tirsa Flores Lanza. Second, supporting the call of the human rights groups for an independent UN-sponsored commission on impunity, following the model of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, or the CICIG. And third, demanding the removal of all corrupt police at the topmost levels. The United States should vigorously support a system of full protectionary measures for all Hondurans in the human rights community and the opposition broadly defined who receive death threats. And finally, I believe the United States should publicly apologize for the role of the Drug Enforcement Administration in the incident in the Mosquitia in May 2012, in which 4 civilians were killed and 4 were injured, and it should provide reparations to the victims and their families. It is my great hope that U.S. policy regarding Honduras will now take a new path, and that a commitment to human rights will be the starting point from now on. Thank you for contributing to that change.
Thank you very much. And now we'll hear from Viviana Giacoman. Am I saying that right? Oh, help me pronounce it right so that Giacoman, who's the Director for Latin America Programs at Freedom House, and we welcome you here. Thank you.
So much, Secretary.
Is your microphone on? Just
Sorry.
the green light.
I think we're fine now. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before the Commission today and provide my thoughts on the situation of violence against journalists in Honduras. I am aware that the Commission and individual members of Congress have been engaged in the human rights situations in Honduras in the past, particularly after the 2009 coup, and I commend your efforts to highlight this issue. Very few people can locate Honduras on a map or name its capital, yet the Central American country beat some world records, including having the highest murder rate in the world and hosting the most violent city in the world outside of a war zone, San Pedro Sula, with 177 killings per 100,000. By comparison, the U.S. has a rate of 5 killings per 100,000 people. Honduras is also one of the most dangerous countries in the world to practice journalism. In my remarks, I will focus precisely on the situation of the press in Honduras, drawing from the analytical and programmatic work of Freedom House, and also from the extensive interviews that I conducted 2 months ago in Honduras with civil society. First, the situation of press freedom. Freedom House, the oldest human rights organization in the United States, have been systematically tracking the state of press freedom in each country of the world since it published the first edition of its Freedom of the Press survey in 1980. The study shows a steady decline in press freedom across Latin America in the past few years, at the deepest and fastest deterioration of any other region in the world. In its 2013 edition, 5 out of the 35 countries of the Americas were considered to have a not free press: Cuba, Ecuador, Paraguay, Venezuela, and Honduras. Based on the numerical scores assigned in the survey, Honduras ranks 140 out of 153 countries analyzed in the world. In Latin America, only Cuba and Venezuela have worse press situation than Honduras. Press freedom in Honduras showed a sharp decline after the 2009 coup, making it the 9th fastest deteriorating country in the world. The violent climate, including intimidation, threats, attacks, and killings of journalists, are the most acute problems, along with the rampant impunity and self-censorship. I'll discuss briefly some of the causes of this violence. Unlike many countries in the world where violence against the press stems from governmental repression against dissidents, violence against journalists in Honduras is multidimensional, complex, and more obscure. And because of that, it is more difficult to tackle. Transnational criminal organizations, drug traffickers, select economic groups, all of which have economic resources and power, are likely behind attacks to the press. In addition, public officials, police forces, and other security sector personnel, often acting in complicity with illegal groups, have also interest in silencing the press. Impunity in Honduras is particularly worrisome and is a decisive factor contributing to violence. The judiciary's capacity to investigate cases brought to them is limited to about 60% of the complaints they receive. Of that 60%, only 20% are actually investigated, and only 1% of that 20% result in convictions. Without a deterrence, violence only spirals. A fundamental question one has to ask when analyzing attacks against the press is whether the violence is a direct consequence of the journalist's work. In the case of Honduras, where judicial investigations into these crimes is almost non-existent, it is a difficult answer to provide. But an analysis of the available data show that the vast majority of the 55 cases of violence against journalists, which includes murders and attacks since 2009, all journalists were reporting or investigating organized crime activities, drug trafficking, local government corruption, land distribution disputes, or issues related to the 2009 coup. It is also important to know, co-chairs, that there are those who argue that as trafficking of drugs throughout Honduras territory has increased, so has the overall violence that typically accompanies this illicit activity. Journalists, in this view, are not being specifically targeted, but are victims of the environment. And the next important question is whether these acts of violence have affected the quantity, quality, and issues journalists report on. In the case of Honduras, the answer is yes. So regardless of its causes, violence has resulted in a great deal of self-censorship. And there, Mr. Co-Chairs, is where the most important danger lies. All of us who care about human rights have the imperative to prevent Honduras from turning into another Mexico. In Mexico, the challenges for the press are similar, but the situation has reached such levels that several states are now information black holes. There's simply no reporting, no information available about any issue related to organized crime or narco trafficking. Even worse, many newspapers barely report when one of their own journalists is killed. Some of the reactions and responses to this violence. Violence reduction strategies require a comprehensive and long-term commitment, including technical assistance and financial resources. They also require the political will to address the underlying causes of violence, including institutional weakness, corruption, lack of transparency of the judicial process, impunity, poverty, and social exclusion. The G16, or group of 16 donor countries and international organizations, plus the government of Honduras, of which the U.S. is a part, has engaged in a number of initiatives related to security sector reform, judicial reform, citizen security, crime prevention, economic growth, and more. In this process, the Honduran government has performed below expectations and has shown neither strong leadership nor robust political will to effectively carry out reforms. In October of 2012, the 22-year-old son of Julieta Castellanos, director of Honduras' largest university and a well-known political figure, was killed, along with a friend, as they left a party. The perpetrators were several police officers, and there is an ongoing judicial process against them, thanks to the persistence of Ms. Castellanos to push for the investigation and trial of her son's case. The case represents a milestone for Honduras societies and the issues of press freedom. The prominence of the rector and her determination in pushing for an investigation and trial of those responsible made the case extraordinarily prominent. Regular citizens
Empathy.
Yeah, demonstrate empathy, yes, with Castellanos' pain and admired her courage. For the first time, individuals and civil society organizations mobilized against impunity while she firmly stood in front of the government and the courts demanding justice. The institutions then responded. Whether the fight against cartels in Honduras is successful, analysts say, will depend in large part precisely on persuading the public to stand up to the intimidation that has impeded investigations and justice. I have 4 recommendations to conclude. First, with general elections coming up in November, it is critically important to keep an eye on each candidate's stand on press freedom. So far, violence against journalists has not been a part of the campaign agenda of any of the political parties, although some of them have expressed their commitment to solve the issues related to organized crime. The U.S. Congress and the administration role urging candidates to specifically focus on addressing violence against journalists could have a tremendous impact. Second, the U.S. government has created a number of initiatives targeting human rights specifically, some of which have been mentioned here. The Bilateral Human Rights Working Group brings together U.S. and Honduran government. and also the creation of the Special Victims Task Force. While the real impact of this effort is yet to be seen, they are steps in the right direction, and the U.S. Congress should encourage the administration to continue this effort, but monitor their impact and improve them as appropriate. Third, while supporting long-term and comprehensive strategies to address the underlying causes of violence, it is equally important to avoid the slaughter of journalists by providing some level of support. One of the recommendations the Honduran government received at the Universal Periodic Review at the United Nations in 2010 was the creation of a national mechanism for the protection of journalists and other vulnerable populations. The Honduran government and civil society worked actually on a law to create such a mechanism, but is currently unimplemented, allegedly due to a lack of funding. The U.S. Congress should specifically target part of its aid to Honduras for the effective implementation of this mechanism. Assistance should include technical advice from the Colombian government, which has over a decade of experience managing a similar program. And finally, the U.S. Congress should encourage the administration to build local capacity by providing technical, financial, and political support to the newly created Ministry of Human Rights and Justice. In particular, for the implementation of their new National Human Rights Plan and human rights public policies, as well as to implement decisions by international courts or organizations, including the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And finally, and we're thrilled that you were here, Tirza Flora Lanza, who's the former magistrate of the Court of Appeals for San Pedro Sula, and we welcome you here and are interested in your testimony, so thank you.
Buenos días a todos y a todas.
Good morning, everyone.
Agradezco a la Comisión Tom Lantos esta oportunidad que me brindan para informarles sobre la situación de derechos humanos en Honduras.
I thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for this opportunity to inform you on the situation of human rights in Honduras.
Lamento mucho tener que comenzar mi testimonio esta mañana con una noticia sumamente dolorosa.
I'm very sorry to begin my testimony this morning with very painful news.
El día de ayer fue asesinada en la ciudad del Progreso en Honduras la jueza Mireya Mendoza.
Yesterday in the city of El Progreso, Honduras, Judge Mireya Mendoza was murdered.
Una profesional con una trayectoria intachable y quien formaba parte de la Junta Directiva de la Asociación de Jueces por la Democracia para la cual trabajo.
She was a professional with an unassailable record who formed part of the board of directors of the Association of Judges for Democracy with which I work.
Esta irreparable pérdida nos llena de profunda preocupación y pone en evidencia nuevamente la profunda crisis de seguridad que actualmente enfrentamos.
This irreparable loss fills us with deep concern and once again shows evidence of the profound security crisis which we currently face.
En donde la vida de los seres humanos no tiene ningún valor, ni siquiera tratándose de una mujer valiente y comprometida con el fortalecimiento del Estado de Derecho, como es el caso de esta colega jueza.
In which the life of human beings has no value, not even the life of a woman who is so brave and committed to strengthening the rule of law, as is the case with my colleague.
Solicito a esta comisión que se pronuncie formalmente exigiendo la investigación inmediata de este hecho.
I request that this commission issue a formal statement to demand an immediate investigation of this crime,
Pues el mismo agrava el clima de precariedad y amenaza para la labor de los jueces honestos.
This crime aggravates the climate of precariousness and threats to the work of honest judges.
Entrando en materia,
Going to the matter of my testimony,
puedo decir que el golpe de Estado del 2009 dejó impactos profundos en las instituciones de justicia.
I can say that the coup d'etat in June 2009 left a deep impact on the institutions of justice.
Las que apoyaron el rompimiento del orden constitucional y se instrumentalizaron para reprimir las manifestaciones de la oposición.
These institutions supported the breakdown of the constitutional order and became a tool to repress the civilian population's protests of opposition.
A partir de este momento hasta la fecha,
From this moment to the present day,
lejos de restablecerse la legitimidad y credibilidad de estas instituciones,
far from reestablishing the credibility and legitimacy of these institutions,
se ha profundizado su fragilidad, politización, negligencia y corrupción.
Their fragility, politicization, negligence, and corruption have deepened.
En relación a la Policía Nacional,
With regards to the National Police,
se creó la Dirección de Investigación y Evaluación de la Carrera Policial en noviembre del 2011 y se aprobó una ley para la depuración de la policía en enero del 2012.
the Office of Investigation and Evaluation of the Police Profession was created in November 2011, and the law to clean up the police was approved in January 2012.
Sin embargo, hasta la fecha no existen resultados efectivos.
Nonetheless, to date, there have not been effective results.
Antes bien, continúan los actos delictivos, la corrupción y las violaciones de los derechos humanos de la población.
In order to prevent criminal acts, corruption, and violations of the human rights of the population,
Tal como ocurrió con la detención ilegal y los malos tratos infringidos a un fiscal de derechos humanos en el occidente del país y la represión violenta a una manifestación pacífica de estudiantes universitarios hace 2 días.
just as occurred with the illegal detention and ill treatment perpetrated against a human rights prosecutor in the west of the country, and the violent repression of a peaceful protest by university students 2 days ago.
Por su parte, el Ministerio Público presenta índices inaceptables de falta de investigación de casos denunciados.
For its part, the Office of the Public Prosecutor presents unacceptable rates of non-investigation of reported cases.
Según datos estadísticos aceptados por el propio fiscal general,
According to official statistical data accepted by the Attorney General himself,
hay un 80% de casos sin investigación ni judicialización.
in some 80% of cases, there has been no investigation and no judicial charges.
Además, existen fuertes cuestionamientos hacia la labor de los fiscales por su ineficacia, falta de objetividad y corrupción.
There are also widespread questions of the capacity of the public prosecutors due to their corruption.
En cuanto al Poder Judicial, se destaca el alto nivel de politización en el nombramiento de jueces y magistrados.
In terms of the judicial branch, it is worth highlighting the high level of politicization in how judges and magistrates are nominated.
Esto debido a que los magistrados de la Corte Suprema de Justicia no son electos por el Congreso Nacional por su capacidad y honestidad, sino en base a su vinculación y obediencia a los partidos políticos.
This is due to the fact that the judges of the Supreme Court of Justice are nominated by the National Congress not for their abilities and honesty, but rather based on their connections and obedience to political parties.
Además, el presidente de la Corte Suprema de Justicia designa por recomendaciones políticas
Furthermore, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Justice designates, through political recommendations,
a los jueces y magistrados de apelaciones, recayendo estos nombramientos en personas sin criterios independientes y sin preparación profesional para el ejercicio de sus cargos.
the appellate judges and magistrates, placing these nominations on people without independent criteria and without professional preparation to exercise their positions.
Ante este escenario de instituciones colapsadas,
Given this scenario of collapsed institutions,
el Congreso Nacional en el mes de abril del 2013
the National Congress, in the month of April 2013,
hizo comparecer al director de Investigación y Evaluación de la Carrera Judicial, al director de la Policía Nacional, al ministro de Seguridad, al fiscal general de la República y al presidente de la Corte Suprema de Justicia para dar explicaciones sobre sus gestiones.
called for the appearance of the Director of Investigation and Evaluation of the Police Profession, the Director of the National Police, the Minister of Security, the Attorney General of the Republic, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Justice to give explanations for their work before the Congress.
Estas comparecencias evidenciaron claramente la ineficacia absoluta de todas estas instituciones y la incapacidad de los funcionarios que se encuentran dirigiendo las mismas.
These appearances clearly demonstrated the absolute inefficiency of all of these institutions and the incapacity of the officials who direct them.
Sin embargo, en lugar de tomar medidas de depuración y reestructuración en todas estas instituciones,
Nonetheless, instead of taking measures to clean up and reform and restructure all of these institutions,
el Congreso únicamente suspendió al fiscal general y al adjunto y nombró una comisión interventora que continúa dirigiendo el Ministerio Público.
the Congress only suspended the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General and named the Comptroller Commission, which still directs the Office of the Public Prosecutor.
Esta acción de intervención del Ministerio Público pudo haber sido el inicio de un proceso de reorganización.
This action of auditing by the Office of the Public Prosecutor could have been the start of a process of reorganization.
Sin embargo, esta posibilidad se ha visto nuevamente truncada.
Nonetheless, this possibility has once again been cut short,
Pues el Congreso Nacional ha mostrado sus verdaderas intenciones al pretender nombrar las nuevas autoridades del Ministerio Público por 5 años.
The National Congress has shown its true intentions by seeking to name the new authorities of the Office of the Public Prosecutor for 5 years,
Cuando de acuerdo con la Constitución, esta elección debe ser hecha en marzo del 2014 por el Congreso Nacional que será elegido el próximo noviembre.
although according to the Constitution, this election should be completed in March of 2014 by the National Congress, which will be elected next November.
Adelantar esta elección es claramente una usurpación de la representación popular.
To move forward this election is clearly a usurpation of the representation of the people.
Lo que pretende el actual Congreso, presidido por Juan Orlando Hernández, candidato presidencial del Partido Nacional,
What the current National Congress, presided over by Juan Orlando Hernández, presidential candidate for the National Party,
es nombrar un fiscal general y adjunto que obedezcan a sus criterios partidarios y que les garanticen que no serán investigados en el futuro por posibles actos de corrupción y de abuso de autoridad.
what he seeks to do is to name an Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General who obey his partisan opinions and guarantee them that they will not be investigated in the future for possible acts of corruption and abuse of authority.
Es por esto que me llama la atención que el senador Kane haya expresado sin mayor preocupación que el nuevo fiscal será electo la próxima semana.
This is why I must note my concern with Senator Kane's comments that the new Attorney General will be elected next week.
Además, he tenido conocimiento que el candidato más fuerte para ocupar este cargo
Furthermore, I've learned that the most strong candidate to occupy this position
es el actual embajador de Honduras en Washington,
is the current ambassador of Honduras in Washington,
con lo cual no quisiera creer que esta elección ilegal tiene el visto bueno del Departamento de Estado.
which causes one to hope that this does not mean that the Department of State is giving its approval to this illegal choice.
Y es que el Congreso Nacional, lejos de nombrar a los funcionarios con criterios de capacidad y honestidad,
And the National Congress, far from naming judges, prosecutors, and human rights commissioners, or other officials with standards of ability and honesty,
siempre ha visto en estas instituciones un botín que debe ser repartido entre los partidos políticos.
has always seen these institutions as a payoff that can be distributed among the political parties.
Esto ha quedado evidenciado también en la negativa de nombrar a los integrantes del Consejo de la Judicatura.
This has also been shown in the refusal to nominate the members of the Council of the Judiciary,
Órgano técnico e independiente que asumiría la atribución de nombramiento y remoción de los jueces, lo que vendría a fortalecer la independencia del Poder Judicial.
This is an independent and technical entity which would assume the responsibility for nomination and removal of judges, which would strengthen the independence of the judicial branch.
Este nombramiento no se realiza desde el Congreso Nacional porque todavía no hay consenso político en la repartición de dichos cargos.
This nomination has not yet been completed by the Congress because there's not yet political consensus, partisan political consensus, for how these positions will be distributed.
En conclusión, las instituciones de administración de justicia se encuentran a merced de la manipulación y el control político partidario.
In conclusion, the institutions for the administration of justice are at the mercy of manipulation and partisan political control,
Lo cual impacta directamente sobre la protección y promoción de los derechos humanos en el país, puesto que provoca total impunidad de las violaciones y abusos.
This directly impacts the protection and promotion of human rights in the country, as it leads to total impunity for human rights violations and abuses.
En consecuencia, es importante tener en cuenta que si las instituciones funcionan correctamente,
Consequently, it is important to bear in mind that if the institutions function correctly,
la cooperación internacional las fortalece.
international aid strengthens them.
Pero si las instituciones están politizadas y vinculadas al crimen organizado y a la corrupción, como sucede actualmente en Honduras,
But if the institutions are politicized and linked to organized crime and corruption, as currently happens in Honduras,
cualquier cooperación financiera, lejos de ayudar al fortalecimiento democrático, favorece al crimen organizado y a los políticos corruptos.
any financial aid, far from helping to strengthen democracy, favors organized crime and corrupt politicians.
Por tal razón, a efecto de que la cooperación de los Estados Unidos sea efectiva y no constituya un fraude para sus contribuyentes,
For this reason, and so that the assistance from the United States may be effective and will not constitute a fraud for the donors,
me permito recomendar que previo a que la misma sea desembolsada, es necesario que se revisen algunos indicadores objetivos de cumplimiento de acciones que fortalezcan el Estado de Derecho.
I respectfully recommend that before financial assistance is paid to Honduras, it is necessary to review certain objective indicators of performance of actions that strengthen the rule of law,
Como las siguientes.
such as the following.
Un verdadero proceso de depuración de la Policía Nacional que arranque desde los mandos superiores y que incluya el juzgamiento de los responsables de hechos delictivos.
A true process of reforming and cleaning up the national police that will begin with the highest senior officers and will include the prosecution of those responsible for criminal acts.
La elección de un fiscal general de la República y su adjunto en marzo del 2014, tal como lo establece la Constitución.
The election of an Attorney General of the Republic and his deputy in March of 2014, as is established by the Constitution.
Y que éste se elija bajo criterios de idoneidad y capacidad y no como producto de un reparto político partidario.
And that he be elected according to criteria of aptitude and capacity, and not as a product of partisan political handouts.
También la depuración y reestructuración del Ministerio Público, incluyendo la creación de una policía técnica de investigación.
Also, the reform and restructuring of the Office of the Public Prosecutor, including the creation of a technical body for investigation.
El nombramiento de los integrantes del Consejo de la Judicatura, garantizando que los mismos serán independientes e idóneos.
Nomination of the members of the Council of the Judiciary, guaranteeing that they are independent and are suitable.
Desde este Consejo se deben impulsar procedimientos claros y objetivos para el nombramiento, la promoción, la destitución y las acciones disciplinarias de los miembros de la Judicatura.
This council should promote clear and objective proceedings for the nomination, promotion, dismissal, and disciplinary actions for members of the judiciary.
El nombramiento en marzo del 2014 de un comisionado nacional de los derechos humanos independiente, honesto, imparcial y con amplia experiencia en materia de protección y promoción de derechos humanos.
The nomination in March of 2014 of a National Human Rights Commission that is independent, honest, impartial, and with extensive experience in the protection and promotion of human rights. That's the National Human Rights Ombudsperson.
Reitero que si no existen instituciones democráticas fuertes e independientes, no habrá protección ni promoción de los derechos humanos en Honduras.
I reiterate that if there are not strong and independent democratic institutions, there will not be protection or promotion of human rights.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And, Ms. Flores, let me, as I said at the outset of my statement, that we were terribly concerned about the assassination of Judge Maria Mendoza-Pena, and I will promise you that this commission will issue a statement and demand that there be an honest investigation and that those who are accountable for this terrible crime be held to justice. So I want to let you know we will do that immediately. And I want to thank everybody for your testimony here today. You have given me a comprehensive summary of the state of the human rights, the state of human rights in Honduras, and it's terribly sad. And things, from what I'm hearing, continue to deteriorate. And what is kind of particularly maddening for me is that it doesn't sound like the U.S. government is playing a very constructive role in trying to promote human rights, challenge the culture of impunity, protect journalists, or any of the things that I think this commission thinks is very, very important. And so, I guess the challenge is, and you've given some recommendations, is like, you know, what do we do? And let me ask generally to any of you or all of you who would like to answer this question. I mean, what would be the impact if the United States stopped and suspended all military and security assistance to Honduras? I mean, what would the impact of that be? Does everyone agree that should be something we should do, right? What do you think the impact of that would be? Dr. Frank, you want to begin?
Well, I think, first of all, it would send a message. Oops, excuse me. It would send a huge message to the Honduran elites and to organized crime about the position of the United States. It would be a huge reversal because up to now, the messages have been weak and ambivalent, and it would send a huge message that the money's not going to continue to flow. There are those that say, well, then we would lose our power, but I think it seems naive to think the United States is going to lose its power over a country that has been so consistently with which the United States has been so consistently in partnership. I don't think that's immediately going to clean up the situation. I think it would have to be part of many other policy recommendations, and I won't repeat them. But I think it would certainly send a huge and powerful message that the United States is serious, and it's not going to continue in this ostensibly friendly partnership, which it seems to be more deeply and deeply engaged with every day.
Flores.
Bueno, realmente yo no me atrevería a pedir directamente la suspensión de toda la ayuda de los Estados Unidos.
Really, I don't ask directly for the suspension of all aid from the United States.
Pero el tema, como lo dije en mi testimonio, es hasta dónde está siendo esta ayuda orientada a fortalecer el Estado de Derecho.
But the real object of the subject of my testimony is to what extent the aid from the United States strengthens the rule of law.
Por ejemplo,
For example,
la elección de un fiscal general bajo criterios políticos que se va a dar posiblemente la próxima semana,
the election of an attorney general under partisan criteria, which will possibly happen next week,
significa un impacto terrible que provoca mayor impunidad.
it represents a terrible impact which would provoke further impunity.
Se intervino y hay un proceso de reorganización supuestamente del Ministerio Público para darle independencia y efectividad.
There is intervention. Supposedly there's an audit underway to reorganize the Office of the Public Prosecutor to give it greater integrity.
Pero todo esto es una nueva frustración para el pueblo hondureño que buscamos justicia, porque con un fiscal politizado no vamos a encontrar esa justicia.
But all of this is a new frustration for the people of Honduras who are seeking justice. The naming of this new Attorney General would not signify justice.
Creo que si eso sucede, apoyar económicamente al Ministerio Público es sencillamente inútil.
If that happens, supporting the new Office of the Public Prosecutor would be useless.
Right. Well, and I guess the point is we have been providing assistance to the government of Honduras. It doesn't seem like it has produced any of the results that you have called for. And I think what I'm trying to figure out is, and especially in light of the certification language, that it was hard for me to believe the administration certified that the aid should go forward. I think if we do not send a strong message to the government of Honduras, then they're going to think we're a cheap date. That they're going to think that, we will the money will keep coming no matter what they do, no matter what the conditionality is, no matter what we say about human rights, no matter how many commission hearings we have. If you can still operate in a culture of impunity, if you can still go after and target journalists who you disagree with, if you can still go after human rights defenders, and people who are trying to engage legitimately in a democratic process and still get the money, and still get, then there's no incentive for those people to change. You mentioned the special prosecutor for human rights, who apparently has opened up more than 400 cases into police abuse, misconduct, murder in the first 5 months of the year alone. He is, I guess, 300 cases this year. I mean, you mentioned how this might be undercut by the election of a very partisan attorney general, but is the government of Honduras given the special prosecutor the resources and support necessary to address all these complaints? And that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. Is this something that we ought to be supporting more of here in the United States? Are there other Honduran government initiatives that are good that we should be supporting?
Que sí. Solamente quisiera aclarar
I would only like to clarify
de que el fiscal especial de derechos humanos
that the special prosecutor for human rights
está bajo la supervisión del fiscal general de la República.
is under the supervision of the
So
Attorney General of the
if you
Republic.
get a bad attorney general,
Yeah,
this guy
that's
can't
it.
do anything.
That's it.
Yeah.
All right.
I would also just say I just got back from Honduras last night, and I did ask people specifically about the question of funding for the Special Prosecutor's Office, and they said not under these circumstances, but also that they do support the head of that office, and they think that they're clean, and this is important, and also the prosecutor for money laundering. But under the political will and the power is not there at the top, and so at this point, further funding would only legitimate the current government. And I myself don't see any Honduran government initiatives that are real that one would want to support. And the problem is, you go down that road, and then it starts looking like they have something that they're improving, when in fact the larger situation is really terrifying and getting worse.
Go ahead.
What I would add is the limiting funding should come hand in hand with a revised strategy of engagement with Honduras, where the priority is not only a negative message of we don't want you to do this, but also we want to see these other priorities. And that discussion should include civil society organizations in Honduras, the Honduran governments, and other players.
But I assume the United States government is engaging. They're not engaging the way we want them to right now. But,
Yeah.
I mean, we're sending aid, we're certifying human rights progress, so, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how to get everybody's attention here that the status quo in Honduras cannot continue, that we've got to do something. And, and maybe what we need to do when the Foreign Aid Appropriations Bill comes up before the House floor, if it ever comes up before the House floor, maybe one of the amendments ought to be a suspension of military and security assistance, and just, put it out there that, look, we've had enough. I mean, people down in Honduras have been through a lot. There have been too many deaths, too many human rights abuses, and I think the message needs to be clear that we're not going to support a government or its security forces, that has such a blatant disregard for the human rights of their own people. We have this strategic dialogue next week. Are there any specific development? I mean, we'll raise the issue of your murdered colleague that ought to be talked about in that strategic dialogue. Are there any specific things that you think ought to come out of that dialogue next week that are real and tangible? Ms. Hogard?
Well, it sounds like raising the issue of the Attorney General would be an important one, as that's right in front of us, as Judge Flores has just mentioned. Supposedly, this is a bilateral dialogue on human rights, so there should be a really tough discussion about specific human rights cases, including those involving state agents, moving forward, and how the government plans to do that, and how the government actually plans to purge the police. One of the things in watching the police reform is that there's all this talk about purging the police, and it's not happening. So that has to be a really central issue in this dialogue. And if there isn't something concrete that comes out about that, then I don't know what it is that they really can talk about.
Have you made any of you provided the administration with your kind of to-do list of what needs to be raised in this dialogue next week?
So there were NGOs that are being asked for in a meeting tomorrow, but I was not, I asked to be part of that and was told there wasn't more space, so I actually haven't had the formal opportunity to do that. I do want to underscore what you said about we are engaged. We are not only funding them, but we're legitimating this government. The ambassador is seen regularly in public, in friendly terms with Juan Carlos Bonilla, with Hector Ivan Mejia, and with Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was the leader of the technical coup in December that overthrew 4 members of the Supreme Court and named new ones the next day. And so we are legitimating as well as funding the Honduran government. So we are, in fact, engaged. I want to call attention just to another date to pay attention to, which is last year, the report from the State Department on whether the human rights conditions had been met was issued in early August. So we want to see, are they going to say again those human rights are going to be met? Are they going to say they're still investigating El Tigre Bonilla? So we want to pay attention to that. That
So we're
should be
expecting a
coming.
new report in a matter of weeks.
Yes, I mean, it came out on August 8th last year.
All right,
So that's a benchmark to pay attention to.
And tomorrow, NGOs are meeting with the,
Yeah, in the morning.
okay.
Some NGOs, others
So,
were not.
I mean, I hope it's a comprehend, you know, we should talk after this about that, but let me, I think what might be helpful with us is if we can get, I assume that there will be probably a consensus among NGOs about what needs to be raised at this strategic dialogue, I'm hoping. I think it would be very helpful for us to have that so that we can follow up immediately, you know, and reinforce the need for some of these questions to be addressed. It would also be helpful for me to know, you know, and Ms. Flores, you, or any of you might, I mean, the role of the United States Embassy. And is our Human Rights Office doing what it's supposed to do? Are we visiting people who have been threatened? Are we pressuring the government of Honduras to investigate cases where people have been murdered? Are we speaking out when journalists are targeted? You know, is our embassy regularly meeting with, you know, people from the, you know, who care about the justice system, human rights advocates? I mean, is it a welcoming place for the people who share the concerns that you have outlined here? Because that's important too. I mean, our embassy is our government in, you know, in particular countries. And, you know, is our embassy responding to the human rights crisis?
I would like to, I'm not going to respond directly to that question because it's a difficult question. But I wanted to add that, yes, you're right in terms of the engagement. There is an engagement. The problem seems to me is that there isn't a strategy for the engagement. And the engagement happens on an ad hoc basis. It is contradictory and many times it benefits those that we don't want to benefit. So the opportunity of the strategic dialogues is to start from scratch that discussion and reestablish priorities and how things are going to take place. I also wanted to say that one concrete recommendation for the bilateral human rights dialogue will be to create some structured and formal mechanisms for civil society to participate in the dialogues. It seems that it's a closed, behind closed doors kind of conversations, and the input of civil society
I think
is
that's a
not
good suggestion.
considered.
Can we just ask about the embassy? I just want to know whether we're...
I want to say something too.
Bueno, yo vivo en Honduras
I live in Honduras.
y yo puedo sentir que el papel de la Embajada de los Estados Unidos no es suficiente.
And I may feel that the role of the Embassy of the United States is not enough. It's not sufficient.
Creo que podrían hacer mucho más.
I believe that they could do a lot more.
Y por ejemplo, la experiencia desde nuestra asociación es que tenemos una muy buena relación con las embajadas de la Unión Europea.
For example, the experience of our association is that we have very good relationships with the embassies of the European Union.
que en algunas ocasiones han hecho pronunciamientos en defensa de amenazas a algunos defensores de derechos humanos,
which in some cases have made statements at key moments in defense of threats to people who defend human rights.
pero en realidad no hemos podido tener el mismo acceso ni la misma comunicación con la Embajada de los Estados Unidos.
But in reality, we haven't had the same access or communication with the Embassy of the United States.
También quisiera reiterar lo relacionado con la participación de sociedad civil en estos diálogos.
I would also like to reiterate my position on the participation of civil society in these dialogues.
He escuchado que se ha dicho que la Secretaría de Derechos Humanos ha elaborado un plan con la participación activa de sociedad civil.
I've heard it said that the Secretariat of Human Rights has developed a plan for human rights with the participation of civil society.
Pero eso no es cierto en su totalidad.
But that is not entirely true.
Realmente, debido a la polarización que produjo el golpe de Estado,
Really, due to the polarization that was produced by the coup d'etat,
existe digamos, una parte de sociedad civil que apoya varias iniciativas gubernamentales, pero que es minoritaria,
there is a part of the civil society that does support numerous government initiatives, but it is a minority.
y otra parte de sociedad civil, de la cual yo participo activamente, y otras organizaciones que no tenemos espacios incluyentes.
And a different part of civil society in which I actively participate, in which we are not included in these spaces.
Y eso debería ser tomado en cuenta a la hora que la ministra de Derechos Humanos diga una cosa parecida.
And that should be taken into account at the moment when the Secretariat on Human Rights does take note of participation.
You guys,
I can't speak for everything that the embassy has done in private, obviously, since the coup, but I've read almost every public word they've said in the newspapers and almost every public statement I have gotten my hands on every day for 4 years. And I have to say, it's been a deafening silence. There have been a few statements about prominent assassinations, but the problem very rarely and usually after the person's dead. For example, Jose Maria Martinez, a prominent trade unionist and radio broadcaster who had a show for 19 years on Radio Progreso, the Jesuit station, has been receiving death threats since June 25th, and a car has been circling around the radio station after his show. The embassy is aware of this and has yet to speak publicly denouncing the death threats against him. And this is just an example of, although it has spoken about the killing of Aníbal Barro after he was kidnapped and then found dismembered, tortured, and killed, obviously. And so it's sad. I think there's also been statements that have sent mixed signals that are even dangerous. For example, Ambassador Kubisky went to Tocoa in the Alwan Valley a couple of weeks ago and said that she was concerned about the crisis and violence in the area, did not denounce the pattern of the killing of the campesinos, including the alleged killings by state security guards working allegedly for Miguel Facusé, but also said that those who are advocating land recuperation should be prosecuted. And this is about this is the ambassador speaking about freedom of speech in another country. And someone was arrested the next day for advocating land occupations. I don't know about that case, but this is really disturbing, both the silence and also this very deliberate mixed signals about which side the embassy is on. And we're not hearing, what you said was so beautiful about what the United States should be doing. We should be there as a vigorous advocate at every turn for freedom of the press, and also we should be speaking out against this incredible pattern of repression of the opposition for 4 years now, and we haven't heard a peep about the concerted repression of the opposition. And that's very dangerous about the messages that this embassy is sending about what it will tolerate.
Lisa, any last words?
I mean, the embassy, I'm sure, has its concerns about police reform and other issues, but in terms of actually getting out there and supporting human rights vocally, this embassy is not doing it. And I totally agree with my colleagues here. They pick only very rare cases where they will speak publicly. They may be following up on something privately, but in terms of getting out there and having a strong and positive presence in favor of human rights and in favor of threatened and attacked journalists, human rights defenders, campesino activists, whatever, it's just not happening.
Well, I regret that very much, and I also regret the fact, quite frankly, that many of us in Congress haven't been more focused on Honduras and haven't been speaking up more loudly. That will change, and I think what you saw here today, not only with Senator Kaine coming here, but also Congressman Wolf, who is a Republican, talked to me about sending a letter to the State Department, as well as putting more pressure on the Honduran government to recognize the importance of human rights. So you're going to have a bipartisan, growing effort here in the Congress, which I hope will be helpful, and I hope will be added pressure. What I would appreciate is that we will do the statement on the assassination of the judge. We'll see if we get that out today or tomorrow morning. But when this meeting happens tomorrow, it would be very helpful if you get back in touch with the Commission to tell us what would be helpful to reinforce. I appreciate the fact that you're on the ground, you work with, all the people that are at risk, and if things are going to change, we're going to have to change, and we're going to have to make it clear to the Honduran government that enough is enough. And so I appreciate your testimony. I appreciate your patience. I apologize for the interruption with votes, but that's the way this place works. There's no sense to the way this place works sometimes. But in any event, thank you very much, and the hearing has come to a close. Thanks.